So this is the exploring, making, and managing breakout session. And is there music in the back? Hi. Hello, everyone. Again, I'm George Villanueva. I'm an assistant professor of advocacy and social change here at the School of Communication. And we're here going to start the panel on exploring, making, and managing. And we have three great scholars: Shannon Oltmann from the University of Kentucky, Matthew Pittman from the University of Oregon, and Timothy H. Engström, did I say? Rochester Institute of Technology. So we're going to first have Shannon Oltmann give her presentation on exploring ethical encryption, and she's going to start right now. Thank you so much.
So thanks for being here. I just want to stress this is a work in progress, so I'm really happy to get feedback either at the end of my talk or later this evening, feedback and ideas, that sort of thing. So I want to start out by explaining sort of the background for my talk. I'm looking at encryption because I'm really interested in privacy and how we enact privacy. And encryption is one way we can do that, right? We can use encrypted hard drives or encrypt our emails and make things more private. In the past 5-10 years, probably 5 years, encryption's gotten a lot easier to use. So encryption's gotten a lot easier to use to the point of sometimes you're just checking a couple boxes, turning some things on. But at the same time, most people don't use encryption. So what's interesting to me is the people who do choose to. Why are they using encryption? And can this tell us something about privacy? I want to ground the discussion of privacy, thinking about privacy, grounded in real life. I should add that this talk is not going to go into any details about what encryption is, how it's set up, the technical background, the algorithms that are used. That's not my focus. There's tons of work out there that explains encryption far better than I could. But I want to, again, look at people who are using encryption. Because there's this problem, I think, with how we talk about privacy. Sort of this, a seminal definition is from Weston in 1967, and it has to do with control over one's information. We know through more research and more philosophical thinking about privacy that privacy is a lot bigger than just control over one's information, but that does seem to be an important aspect of privacy. Scholars have said there's no single encompassing definition of privacy. People like Solov and Nissenbaum have argued for a family of resemblances, looking at contextual integrity, talking about privacy as a fuzzy concept, which I think is helpful in some ways, but sorry, I changed my slides at the last minute, so I'm trying to remember what's on the next slide. The problem with a lot, or the gap that is in a lot of privacy research is it tends to be pretty abstract and theoretical. It's not really tied into what people are doing to protect their privacy. The steps people take, how we think about privacy in our daily lives. So that's the gap that I'm trying to fill with this work. So I did qualitative interviews. I talked to 15 people, and I'll touch more on why that number is low at the end. It was a fairly homogeneous group, and the interviews were conducted via Skype or telephone, recorded with their permission, then transcribed and analyzed. And again, I focused on encryption that requires action taking. So most of us use encryption like when we're checking our bank statements online, ordering something from Amazon, right? Those transactions are encrypted. But I wanted to look at things where, at situations where people are taking active steps to utilize encryption. So the respondents kind of had three reasons for using encryption. First was they talked about security, securing their data, keeping it safe from other people. They also talked about validity and verification. So it was a way to ensure that the email, for example, that they wanted to send was the email that got sent. That information was received only by the intended person. The intended person got exactly the information that was intended, and just validating that whole process from beginning to end and verifying that there was no middleman, no attack on the information, that sort of thing. And then they talked a lot about privacy, which is not surprising. But the respondents said that privacy was very important to them, that they saw encryption as a way to protect their privacy. They talked about being paranoid about privacy. 2/3 of my respondents, without prompting, brought up being paranoid about encryption, paranoid about privacy. That was part of why they used encryption. They said that they were worried about the government, they were worried about criminals and corporations. So some of the encryption was done to protect against cybercrime, things like stealing passwords, hacking data. A lot of people were worried about corporations such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, taking their data and then using the data to make inferences, to influence future purchasing decisions, things like that, and they wanted to protect their data from these corporations. And then there were people who were concerned about government surveillance, and they felt like using encryption was a way to counteract or block some government surveillance. They could restrict access to what the government had on them. Like this respondent said, the NSA will have my information, I'm sure of that. But if all they have is an encrypted email, they're not able to read it. Now, he went on to say whether or not it's something that's valuable to them, that's immaterial. The fact is, I'm blocking them from reading it, and that matters to me. Along with this concern about government surveillance were some deeper concerns. People were worried about the effect that government surveillance has on how we think, how we act, our freedom of speech. Some actually invoked the Big Brother metaphor. Others just talked more generally about it, about using encryption as a political choice, a political act to counter this government surveillance. And they worried that people who don't use encryption might start to change the way they speak, change their openness of communications, and even eventually change the way they think. So they were trying to take a stand against that and be very deliberate by choosing to use encryption. And then I asked respondents to define privacy. Several of them said that it was really hard to do, which we know. But a lot of them mentioned control as one aspect, controlling their information, controlling their data. And several said, you may not actually have control, but with encryption, you feel like you have some control. You feel like you're a little more in charge of your data and your information. So it was about control generally, and then specifically about protecting data, keeping data out of the hands of nosy and nefarious people. So, as I said, this is a work in progress, but there's some implications I think we can talk about, and one is methodological. People who really value their privacy, it turns out they're not very keen to talk about it. That might be obvious in hindsight, but I don't think it was obvious at the outset. And if we want to study privacy in context, study privacy on the ground, we need to take this into account. It's hard to talk to people who really value their privacy. You need some sort of entree or trusted insider. One of the most successful approaches I had was I interviewed one man, and he shared the interview information, the recruitment information with members of his computer group. And I got 2 or 3 members from his computer group to agree to be interviewed because he was kind of an insider who vouched for me in some degree. So that's something to really consider if we're looking at privacy. I found it especially difficult to recruit people beyond the computer security community. That may be because there's not a lot of non-computer people who are using encryption, but it may just be because, again, I don't have the resources to break into those groups at that time. There's some theoretical implications as well. So, as I've said, privacy scholars suggest that we should look at privacy in specific contextual situations, examine how privacy is enacted and used by people. And the people I talked to had two different conceptualizations: control over one's personal information, but then they also talked more broadly about the importance of privacy for freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and democracy itself. So they saw privacy in a more abstract way as well. So both of these have been described, both of these conceptualizations have been described in the literature and at least partially validated through this research. As I said, it's a small and pretty homogeneous sample, so there's some limits to that. And I only looked at one context of privacy. So I'd like to look for more users of encryption, and if you happen to use encryption, come see me afterwards. And also look at other contexts of privacy, other situations where we invoke privacy or we really value privacy. And I use this cartoon because I'd love to talk to people who don't go through the normal TSA screening process at the airport. Either they've gone through the process they've gone through the procedures to get around the regular screening process, or they decide they don't want to do the backscatter X-ray machine, and they go for the pat-down. Right, those are people who are valuing their privacy in different ways, and be interesting to talk to them, but also probably really difficult. People in airports tend to be in a hurry. Another idea would be to look at some conceptions of privacy and figure out some quantitative ways to examine them. So those are some steps I hope to take in the future. But that's my work so far. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. So we're going to hold off for questions until after the three presentations. So next is going to be Matthew Pittman from the University of Oregon.
Good morning, good afternoon. So I'm Matt Pittman, PhD candidate. I just started dissertation work last week. My dissertation is on social media and how loneliness and personality affect college students' use of different platforms. So a little backstory, because I think it's interesting to know why people study what they study. So in one of my classes, a media literacy class, this is last year, one assignment was for students I said, whatever social media platform you all use the most, Google or use whatever your preferred search engine is, their terms of service, and read until you find something you didn't know, and then come report back on that. And most of them said, obviously they'd never read past the first couple lines, and they came back with all kinds of incredible, oh my gosh, Professor Pittman, I didn't know. They can use my data, my pictures for anything, and they get any profits, and I get in trouble if anything bad happens. They couldn't believe it, but they still use it every day, all the time. So that week, the week of that assignment, a student came to me and said, she found one of her snaps. So Snapchat, I feel like we all probably know, but it's ephemeral video or picture, you take a little picture of yourself. They have filters. There's one, I think the most popular one that my 2-year-old loves is where you're a dog. So it gives you puppy dog ears, and if you open your mouth, it gives you a little tongue, and it goes, and you lick the screen. It's very cute. People send that to each other. And they have one where there's a bunny, So it gives you a really cute bunny face, and then when you open your mouth, it goes, ah, and it turns into like a demon, scary-looking bunny, some out of a horror movie. So this student follows a couple different Twitter accounts. I think this one's called Basic White Girl or something. It puts out tweets about like pumpkin spice lattes and Ugg boots and stuff like that college-age girls love. And she found a snap that she sent to her friend appeared on the typical girl tweet, and they used it for, well, like, case of the Mondays type thing. Oh, this is me on Monday, I'm so angry, but by Friday I'm happy. So this was pretty unsettling for her, and I asked her, oh my gosh, is this going to change how you use Snapchat? Is this going to make you use it less? She's like, well, no, it's horrible, but what else am I going to do? I still got to use it to communicate with my friends. So this got me thinking about how different social media I was sort of trained as a theologian, and my bridge over to communication studies, which was what I do, was media ecology, which says different media, different environments have different effects on us. So I was thinking maybe image-based social media cause us to think differently than text-based social media. So when I set out on this, later, once it became ethical, because as we've discussed many times, anything with now that life is digital, communication is digital, it always has ethical implications. So Reidenbach and Robin have a pretty good business ethics framework that we'll look at in a second that I applied to this. Media multiplexity theory, which just says the closer you are with someone, the more media you use in communicating with them. So your spouse, you're pretty close. You're probably going to talk, text, Facebook, a whole bunch of stuff, whereas your friend from high school or middle school that you didn't really know that well, if Facebook goes away, your relationship goes away because you're only using one platform. And various aspects of computer-mediated communication, so ephemerality, permanence, modality, all that stuff. So this is from my dissertation. I broke down different social media according to their various components. And then this is where my dissertation goes, not where we're going today necessarily, but I think it's helpful for thinking about how we use different media. So I conceptualize it as weak time media require very little of us, so I can tweet at any one of you and it takes me about 5 seconds. But certain things cost more in terms of time or investment, and those are potentially more rewarding. So any kind of FaceTime live video can be very refreshing, right? It feels like the person is really there, but you can't do that with a bunch of people at once. So jumping over for a second to advertising, which is weird. Think about what advertising typically uses affective emotional appeals, because that's more powerful than rational appeals for this sort of thing. So on the left, this is a screenshot of if the Coke machine wasn't there on the side, you wouldn't know what it's an ad for, but it's an ad for Coke. And it has young, beautiful looking people hanging out and they're all drinking Coke. And I think this was for the new emoji labels, which I doubt that's still a thing because that seemed kind of like a fad. But they're very happy, and it's because they're drinking Coke. So no information about the product, all affect, zero logic. Whereas certain products, light bulbs, bleach, toothpaste, it's hard to create an emotional connection with that. So they just say, hey, our product works better than somebody else. Get you to buy it that way. So going back to my student, and really all of us who agreed to terms of service that we don't read, I started to think about how for text-based platforms, it makes sense to have text-based terms of service. But why is it that for image platforms, we still have text-based terms of service? It's the standard. It's what everybody uses. So it makes sense, but it seems unfair that something we use that might affect our emotions, we're asking people to read through however many pages and agree to stuff that they have no idea what's going on. So I thought of, and by the way, I encourage you all to Google or whatever search Easter eggs in terms of service, because coders and writers have fun too, and they sneak in all kinds of things. Last night I saw a list of things that Apple has snuck into their iTunes agreement, and it's stuff like, not we own your soul, but we own all products that ever start with an I, If you don't agree to use this, you're a Luddite, so have fun living in your cave. Stuff like that. So if we were to do an ethical audit for the standard terms of service, where it's just dozens, if not hundreds of pages, using Reidenbach and Robbins. So they took a whole bunch of ethical frameworks, virtue ethics, some deontology, some utilitarian, put it all together and came up with three areas. The first of which would be just a broad-based moral equity spectrum. Is it just or unjust, fair or not fair? So for this one, the word maybe wasn't supposed to appear until just now. So do they pass the first one? You could say, yes, it's just, because we sign it so we get what we deserve. Construct 2, the relativist construct, is it culturally acceptable or traditionally acceptable to own and profit from somebody's image or data they create, but then they're held liable if they post anything bad? Maybe not really. It's kind of culturally acceptable. We all sign the terms of service, but doesn't necessarily make it right. And the final one, the social construct, does it violate an unspoken promise? I would say yes, it does. When we use these, there's a lot of the talks today have been about privacy, what it means today, and I hope before we leave, I hope Don Hyder at the end just gives some definitive one-sentence definition of privacy, just so we can leave with some kind of closure. But it's really hard to define. Is it ownership, or is it about consent? Is it awareness? If a tree falls in the forest, you don't hear it. If Snapchat or Instagram uses my image and sells it to a Twitter account like that, and I never know about it, is my privacy infringed on? So what do consumers think? So to pre-test, I like using mixed methods to kind of test what I'm thinking about. Does anybody here know what Mechanical Turk is? Amazon's Mechanical Turk, by a show of kind of nods or something? Okay, yeah. So I ran a study on MTurk. I think I had about 100 people, and it's a good MTurk. You can get any demographic spread you want. So it's evenly split between male and female, good ages, mostly Americans. So I did a little survey experiment. It was really simple. They log on. I say, here's what we're doing. And then I ask them, either they go to one of two conditions. One, I say, just go use a text-based social media for 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, Twitter or email, because I feel like not everybody has Twitter. So if you don't have Twitter, just email someone for 2 minutes. And the other half, they were asked to go do something image-based. So go to Facebook and look at pictures of your cousin, or go to Snapchat or Instagram or whatever. So 2 minutes to prime them with one modality or the other. So how many of you would have agreed with me that I thought people that went to the text condition, because text makes us think logically and rationally, how many of you would have thought that going to the text base would make them be more concerned about privacy or more aware of privacy? By a show of maybe nods. So yeah, you are optimistic like me. So what are you looking at on the left? This is the privacy concern, so a really simple Likert scale. When I agree to a platform's terms of service, I'm concerned about privacy. 1 would be disagree, 7 would be agree, so the higher the number, the more they are concerned. So this was text and image. On the left is people that went to text platforms, and you can see they do not care. On the right is people that went to image-based platforms. They cared more about privacy. So this was the opposite of my hypothesis. I was proved wrong. But sometimes when you're doing research and you end up being wrong, it's good because it can generate more questions. Similar thing. So this was the curveball. I realized the big difference wasn't between image and text, but it was between mobile and desktop or laptop. So you can see the green bars are people that are on their mobile device, and there's no difference between text or image. The biggest difference is on the very, very left, that blue bar. That's somebody who is on a laptop and using text, so just standard email. This is perception of privacy. They perceived that, I said, how private was your activity just then? They perceived it to be the least. This was like the most significant number in here. But the people who were doing text on a mobile device, so using Twitter on your phone, perceived that to be more private. And if all this is a little confusing, it was for me too, and I'm going through the data, and it's confounding me at every turn. So some problems with terms of service, and with this, I'm just trying to rethink what it would mean to how could we improve on terms of service for platforms. One of the problems, and Meg said this morning in the very first keynote, the updates come way too often. So even if you were to read through it once and take a week of your life and retreat and just read these things, you would have to read it again in a week or a month when they updated the new one. Consumers feel like they have no power or agency, so even if Matt Pittman, I'm going to make a stand. I'm not going to sign this. I'm not going to agree to this iTunes thing. Well, what would that do? We feel like we're powerless in pushing back against corporate giants. And two, the problem with kind of the social science approach that I take is privacy concerns don't always equal privacy behavior. So even if we're concerned, like all of us would say, yeah, I'm concerned about privacy. But that's not always reflected in our actions. Humans are predictably irrational, to use the term, which makes studying this really difficult, kind of what Shannon was saying about, yeah, it's hard. The more concerned somebody is about privacy, the harder it is to get accurate information out of them. Solutions, what can we do about it? Yeah, I like Lord of the Rings. Some people didn't like the Hobbit movies, but I think even the worst Tolkien movie is still better than the best movie with Fast and Furious in the title. So potential solutions, maybe too long didn't read clauses or cheeky summary clauses with links to the full text. For visual media, show a picture along with the text. So most of us have probably put together IKEA furniture at some point. Their instructions have to transcend language because they don't know who's buying it. So they have images and little cartoonish drawings that a 10-year-old in any country could probably eventually put it together. So what would it look like for a terms of service to take that form? If you had to draw in pictures what it looks like to have your data be sold. And then transparency is the new objectivity. Somebody, Matt, I don't think he's in here right now. Yeah, he is. We talked about how pure transparency actually isn't possible anymore. So if it's a gradient, then how transparent would terms of service need to be for us to understand actually what we're getting ourselves into? And that's it.
Thank you, Matt. Now we're going to have Tim Engström from Rochester Institute for Technology.
What I want to do first is violate the first and most important protocol of a digital conference, which is to do nothing at all digital. I'm going to show nothing on the screen, but I do want to talk about imaging, and I thought I might have a better chance of explaining what they do if I didn't show you seductively how they do it. So what I've done is given you an outline, so there will be some, as you can see, some nostalgia in my argument for materiality. And my hope is that you have a remnant of my talk to take home, and also that you'll need the talk to make sense of what would otherwise be incomprehensible bullets. My interest is in imaging. And my interest here is that as we look at the history of objectivity as a construction in the sciences and in philosophy, we see that objectivity has always been constructed in relation to the technologies we have for representing what we know. And the means of representing what we know have traditionally been images. We've been desperate to convert acts of knowing into acts of seeing. And the persistence of this visual paradigm is what I want to take up, and how it has changed dramatically in kind in the digital era. What I want to do first is piggyback on the superb work of Peter Gallison and others, which you may be aware of, in the history and philosophy of science. And what intrigues me is the way in which he identified in the Renaissance and the emergence of perspectival illustrations a new mode of objectivity. What was intriguing about that mode of objectivity is that medical illustrations of the body weren't in fact photographically realistic. They would have been useless if they were. The purpose of an illustration was to actively suppress a myriad of different details or particulars in order, in fact, to arrive at the aesthetic construction of essences or forms or shared properties that a lot of different bodies had or possessed. So what he is getting at is that objectivity was, in fact, the function of an aesthetic idealization, not a direct transcription. So in other words, an illustrator didn't illustrate what he or she saw. In fact, the point was to teach people to see what the illustration provided, so that one knew essentially what was useful in the illustration in surgery or in physiology. Gallison sees a very, very significant change with the emergence of industry and photography. And suddenly the very notion of objectivity changes over to a direct mechanical transference, an analogical transference to film. So what one wants is not an aesthetic genius to provide essences, but a different kind of a persona, a very modest, non-intervening persona who would simply click a button. And rather like the emergence of industry, if you will, in the 19th century, the role of photography is analogous. What we want is the labor in the production of the image to be something that anybody could do without violating what it's an image of. So it needs to be a literal analogical transcription. It turns out, of course, that just as this notion of objectivity is taking hold in the sciences, it turns out that almost all photographs are totally useless. They're fuzzy, they're murky, they're too particular, they don't give us the generalizability we're after. So instead of having types that help us understand tokens, suddenly photography gave us an infinite number of tokens, but no clarity on the types. So this had to be remedied over time. Gallison then talks about a more contemporary era of imaging, which is, if you will, on the transition to the digital. And that's what he calls essentially interpretive imaging or interpretive judgmental objectivity. The standard case of this would be in physics, of course, in astronomy, where one gets multispectral imaging that visualizes data that are not themselves in the visual spectrum. So you need interpretive expertise to know how it is that such an image could be representing the real, when in fact it's imaging things that aren't visualizable in any way. This suddenly moves us into a very different era. What I want to suggest with computational objectivity is something very, very different indeed. As computational imaging emerges, we have the translation of the real into something that never did come to our attention through any kind of direct observational schema, no observational instrument. And what I want to talk about as an example of this is going to be the fMRI, the functional magnetic resonance image, and what that is doing to how we conceptualize our own brains, how it's recasting the very notion of ontology as computational, and submitting brains and bodies to a regime of speed organized around algorithms and softwares of speed that in fact end up circumventing most of the deliberative and judgmental competencies we have traditionally associated with medicine. I know that's a big mouthful, so let me see if I can unpack that a little bit. What's interesting to me about classical epistemology and objectivity is it's at least transacted on the assumption of transparency. That is to say, you have to show your data to somebody else. And there's a kind of procedural transparency that guarantees at least that a scientific community will offer some cooperation of your assertions. When it comes to functional or computational imaging, this very most basic condition of scientific objectivity is simply absent, and we almost seem unaware of its absence. What we show are the consequences of data, but we can't in fact reveal the production of the data, because the production of the data through algorithms and softwares is proprietary. So this has essentially shifted the productivity of the image to industry and away from science. Science is now a dependent imaging apparatus that has to buy the tools of the imaging on the basis of underlying software and programs that the scientists themselves do not control, cannot unpack, and are not the persons who put together the code. So now the origin of the image is distributed across a wide variety of code producers who are not available for scrutiny when it comes to asking what norming assumptions, translational assumptions, ontological translations are simply implicit in the operation of code. This seems to me to be a paradigmatic shift in how we understand what images do, what kinds of objectivity they claim, and where expertise and power and agency resides if it's distributed across unavailable platforms of algorithms and statistics. Okay. Now the fMRI is my example. One might have thought that the fMRI is somehow analogous to a picture, and as we now know, of course, it is not derived in any way from pictures. It's an algorithm that operates on the basis of statistical modeling and mapping, so that it is in fact an image or a computational construct all the way down. It has never been predicated upon any actual image of particular brains. It's a statistical composite. So what happens in terms of the ontological norming and statistical homogenization is that you might think that if you go in for an fMRI, it's in fact a picture of your brain. It's no such thing. It's always already a relationship between the data gathered from your brain in relation to a statistical model against which we measure difference. But the point is, the kinds of differences we might be most interested in can't be made visible because they're already exorcised from the statistical map. So what happens is that the norming algorithms, and this is what I really, really love, in a moment of unintended poetic irony, these algorithms are called warping algorithms, and indeed they are. What they do is take, essentially, the so-called white noise of the computational data and then arrange it in such a way as to ensure that those kinds of things that might otherwise have been unruly outliers aren't available in the image in the first place. And what we can then do is medicalize those outliers so that what we see is not a brain that's emerged over longitudinal time, over phenomenological time, over ecological and complex social relations. It's an embrainment. It's an atomic entity whose history is invisible as a result of the kind of imaging produced. So we have, again, a very significant transformation of what it is to be a brain, and therefore to have an identity related to the brain. And this is all predicated upon a computational theory of what is best able to represent the human brain. Now, in the interest of time, what I want to shift to quickly, because I'm getting through my outline not at all, is to move very quickly to number 3. I'm going to skip over the computational theory of mind, as wonderful and as exciting as it is. There are a bunch of cyber evangelicals that I would love to quote to you who actually really think the brain just is a computational device. And I'm interested in how we have literalized the metaphor of computation and no longer treat computation as a metaphor for some things neurobiology might do, but in fact have just decided to substitute it altogether for neurobiology. The brain just is a computational device. And this is an extremely widely used and prevalent theorization of the mind or the brain. What I want to move on to is a different kind of governmentality, and that is not just to the governmentality of software and algorithms that are not transparent to us, but to the governance or governmentality of speed. And that is to say that if we're going to talk about the ethical, we have to talk about the space within which the ethical could be operative. And if we keep relying increasingly on digital technologies to represent what's real or true, and they continue to operate at the speed of light, which is how they achieve their efficiency and utility, then we actually constrain significantly the deliberative space where ethics really would matter. And so I want to talk about this trade-off that we are implicitly engaged in at the moment with the governmentality of speed. And in the longer paper, I talk about some people like Milan Kundera, and his interest in slowness and the role of the novel as a genre of human exploration, but other genres that don't lend themselves as easily to digitization as producing the necessary slowness to think ethically. That's a lot that I won't sort of elaborate on just now. Let me flip over to one of my other examples, and that's the driverless car. Many of you will think, of course, as we're being taught to think, that the driverless car is going to be a significant improvement in the moral and ethical problems of driving. It will create such lightning-fast decision-making that fewer people will die. We'll be in much better hands if we simply allow digital technologies to manage our spatial incompetence for us. And I'm not saying that they won't manage our spatial incompetence for us with tremendous success. What I'm getting at is that we would be mistaken to call those achievements ethical, that anything that is done at the speed of light doesn't require the kind of imaginative, empathetic, incalculable moves that we associate with the ethical. So when someone does something out of love for someone, out of ethical risk for someone, out of some other kind of disposition to care, those kinds of decisions are made precisely because they don't reduce to the calculable and because they aren't decisions that could be made in the absence of time. I think I have to get there. Where I turned in the paper is toward from the governmentality of speed and digitization to the governance, or to spaces where the operations of the digital can be held accountable to governance, that is to say, to oversight. into real spaces where real deliberative engagement with the implications of digital can happen. And what I do in the paper is try to articulate where those spaces could be produced within the institutional settings in which the digital is operative. I choose the university as one of those settings where governance, in my judgment here, has to be governance as organized around people who don't have a proprietary or for-profit interest in the operations they're assessing. It is multidisciplinary, as it is in a university setting. It makes policy, as it should. It makes very, very powerful recommendations as to how the application of technology should proceed, because we care about the people to whom it's applied, our students. So I just want to sort of articulate some vague skeletal model where governance could meet governmentality and make a difference. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any questions? Audience?
I have a question for Shannon. I'm wondering if assuming the rise of encrypting instant messaging has been, from my viewpoint, the biggest change in encryption. Can you just go out and ask people who uses Signal or who uses WhatsApp and how they feel about encryption?
How would I go ask people? I'm not sure. Can you give me a little bit more what you're thinking?
Well, I mean, at this point, I think, well, in parts of the world, the penetration of WhatsApp is such that you ask a random sample of people, and and half of them will be using it. So we're getting to the point where, in many contexts, the average person has access to strong encryption.
Right, I think that's true, but I think perhaps the average person doesn't realize they're using encryption. Or hasn't made a conscious choice. Maybe I'm using WhatsApp because my buddies use it. I'm not using it because it's an encrypted messaging system. I do think that, sampling randomly could be an interesting way to get some people. I quasi-randomly sampled by soliciting people from Facebook and some journalism groups. That's not really random sampling, but I mean, I distributed, my recruitment messages as broadly as I could think, and it was hard to find people. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Professor Engström about your point number 2 on digital ontology. I just wondered if you could comment a little bit on the ethics of even approaching the idea of the human mind as a computational device.
Sadly, I'm not entirely sure what the question is. Could you say it one more time?
I guess we can do it as a yes or no. Do you think it's ethical to even think of the human mind as a type of computer, as a computational thing?
I think it's entirely ethical so long as we don't lose sight of the fact that it's a metaphor. When Galen said the heart is a pump, we were quite happy to call it a pump because we knew it was metaphorical. The history of science is replete with very creative and useful metaphors. My problem is twofold. One is that we almost always adopt the latest technology as a way of redescribing ourselves in terms that are favorable to the technology. That's the mistake. So I think we've become so enamored of the digital and the computational, we're way too tempted to redescribe ourselves in only computational terms and then privilege them. That's an ethical mistake, a short-sightedness. But that it's a productive metaphor, I don't disagree with. It's the literalization of the metaphor that I do think is unethical, yes. That was a long yes.
This is for Matt. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I wonder if there is a possible answer, or at least a component of an answer to your puzzle of why the people you interviewed did not think about text as important as visual media. You had this puzzle, didn't you? When it came to privacy, or wasn't that so?
Yes, you're saying
But one of these things, I mean, people took more seriously if they would be publicized on images or kind of image-related media than on textual media. How did you formulate it? But
Yes.
this was the gist of it.
Well, part of the problem with studying this, and this is sort of a similarity between Shannon and I's work. And this is with quantitative, so mine was quantitative, right? So people were taking a survey, they were just clicking, agree, ones, they're clicking there.
That's right, but I'm just providing a suggestion to you. Okay, was like a preamble. Well, what age were these people in general that you interviewed? Could there be such a distribution that the people who took text seriously are older people who are used to reading books, and the other ones are people who are born with clicking around?
Right, that's what I thought.
And that is reality for them.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought for sure, because the kind of, what we see in the popular press is like, oh, millennials, they live their lives on their phones, and old people are Luddites and don't adapt to technology. But age was not a significant, but I would have, you would think that it would be, but. Habits, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of factors, which is why usually I work with personality and loneliness, but yeah, it could be habits, could be disposition toward the technology, are they? We all work with personality. Yeah, that's true. Everyone does.
My question is also for Matthew Pittman and your surprise finding with regard to the desktop versus mobile slide. And I'm wondering about the definitions the users were working with regarding the conflation of privacy and security, right? Was it kind of a confusion, perhaps, of what privacy meant, which it kind of alludes to your preamble for a working definition of privacy that everyone can kind of go on, and I'm wondering if there were different definitions of privacy at work there.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the survey, the problem with surveys is if I give too specific of an answer of what I think privacy is, then I might prime them to get a little paranoid. If I said privacy could be defined as any of your data that maybe, if the more specific I get, the more I could prime them to think in a way that's not as natural. So the scales were, I think the question was something, I tried to keep it really generic and simple, like thinking about the last 2 minutes of your social media use, comma, and then was the statement an agree or disagree. So I was concerned about privacy. I think privacy is important. So I had two things. I had how much they perceived it, and then how much they cared. So again, there's possible conflation there. And MTurk, it's great for some things. It's a useful tool, but there's also the possibility somebody has the TV on and they're texting their friend and they're not really paying attention. So maybe they didn't read it carefully. And you can control for some of that stuff and look for some social desirabilities for it. But yeah, that's the problem, is privacy might mean something to a 60-year-old in Kansas than it did to, somebody in their 30s in Oregon who's running this. That's a good question.
Question for Tim. Hello. You talked about speed a lot, and really digital, and aspects of whether speed is almost a ultimate kind of consequence of the digital. Do you see any backlash against speed, and potentially like with so many slow food movements, slow city movements, kind of return to community, trying to find a sense of community now with digital aspects? Do you see potentially also a backlash on whether the digital is going to be rethought away from speed and potentially?
No, I mean, I think as Lily said in her talk, the advent of a new form of imaging doesn't eradicate the old ones or the role the old ones continue to play. And likewise, I think here, while I think it's a governmentality, and this is what changes its power over us, I don't think that it totalizes the field of human experience at all. In fact, it's all very, very complicated. In other words, people will use speeds that operate at the apps that operate at the speed of light in order to find which restaurant has slow food. It's going to be very complicated in terms of how urban space gets mapped by algorithms. It changes entirely how people experience urban space. They'll still find their little niche in the restaurant, but something still will have changed even as they find it. So I think it's kind of both ways. So the slowness we experience will still be altered, I think, significantly by the mediation of speed.
Any other questions? Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.